It's the Wonkhe Show. A Labour drubbing, a leadership wobble and a skills bill nowhere to be seen. We'll chat the impact of Starmergeddon on UKHE. MPs say no one knows what happens when a university goes bust. Is a bespoke insolvency regime finally on the way? And it's Eurovision week. What does English HE have in common with its continental cousins and what doesn't it? It's all coming up.
Jim, you're talking about Eurovision, we're talking about Starmergeddon. Is it not true, in fact, that what we really need Labour MPs to do is a bit more of making your mind up?
Welcome back to the Wonkhe Show, your weekly way into this week's higher education news, policy and analysis. I'm your host, Jim Dickinson, and here to help us make sense of what on earth's going on, as usual, three top-line guests. In Bristol, Brooke Church is Chief Exec at GuildHE. Brooke, your highlight of the week, please.
Hi, Jim. Lovely to be with you. Highlight of the week for me is a personal one. I was able to go and watch my daughter, who's a figure skater, in her coaching session yesterday morning, which I don't often get to see, so that was fun for me.
Excellent stuff. In Buckinghamshire, Jonathan Simmons is partner and head of the education practice at Public First. Jonathan, your highlight of the week, please.
Morning, Jim. Morning, everyone. Yeah, I've just come back from a couple of days in Norfolk, where I was on a client retreat in a very nice country house, so that was incredibly pleasant.
Great stuff. In Frome this week, David Kernohan is Deputy Editor at Wonkhe. DK, your highlight of the week, please.
Have to say that the Office of Students releasing a load of data on franchise and partnership arrangements and not telling anybody was a bit of a highlight for me.
And I never get to say my highlight of the week because, I like to present it. But
what's your highlight of the week?
My highlight of the week was watching Moldova open semi-final one of the Eurovision Song Contest live in Vienna. Saluti a tutti, Moldova is on duty. Right, so we start this week with Starmergeddon. Last week's elections were grim for Labour. The knives are out for Keir Starmer and the King's speech has no HE in it, DK.
So, yeah, back in 2024 at the election, a few of us breathed a little sigh of relief because no matter what happened next, there wouldn't be any more leadership psychodrama. We wouldn't have to deal with a leadership election every few months and all that stuff. And that seems not to have lasted very long. The national elections in Wales and Scotland and the council elections, the third of the elections that we got in this part of the cycle, pretty disastrous as expected for Labour, didn't really make much in the way of progress and lost heavily both to Reform and to the Green Party in England. So since then, there's been the expected discussion about whether or not Keir Starmer has to go and whether or not Wes Streeting or somebody else is going to replace him. Keir himself has had a number of chances to reset things. The King's speech was perhaps the expected centrepiece after the local start of the new parliamentary term. There wasn't a lot in there to get super excited about, especially if you're interested in higher education and the problems that it is currently facing. It was a real surprise for us not to get what we were calling a skills bill. This cropped up in a few places in actual government press releases and stuff, so it was clearly on the cards. And on the site, if you've not been following along that closely, I've got a list of all the things that they've said, oh yes, we need to wait for a suitable legislative vehicle in order to fix. So there's quite a lot of things that urgently need doing that it now looks like is not going to happen this parliamentary term.
Well, fascinating stuff. And just to say, obviously, we're recording this at, what time is it now? Back home, 9:38 a.m. on Thursday. So by the time this goes out, all sorts of stuff could have happened. But bearing in mind where we are now, Jonathan, I think I'd expected to wake up this morning and find a Wes Streeting leadership challenge, but it hasn't quite happened yet. What would that mean if Wes wins?
Well, a fine and noble tradition of the NUS presidency leading on to national glory, I think. I mean, look, there's a huge amount going on at the moment. I've currently got the Wonkhe podcast screen on half my screen. I've got the Guardian live blog on the other half of my screen because, as you say, it's eminently possible that something will happen in the next hour whilst we're on air, at which point we'll all frantically record. I think there's sort of two things to say, really. One is that, I mean, as DK just said, it is quite staggering in a way that more or less 2 years, or not even 2 years, since winning what by all historical standards is almost a record-breaking majority, Keir Starmer is now the most unpopular popular Prime Minister on record, has just been absolutely hammered in the local elections from, Cumbria to Carlisle to Cheltenham to Chichester. And we are facing a circumstance in which every single person in the Parliamentary Labour Party thinks he is not going to be the Prime Minister that leads him into the next election. So the only question is when it happens. Wes Streeting, a fan of the show, I hear, has, he's hardly hidden his desire to become Prime Minister. I think it is safe to say that if he did become Prime Minister, a couple of things would happen. One is that actually there would be a reasonable amount of policy changes. So not just in higher education, but in school-age education, in health, in justice, potentially even in our relationships with the European Union. So I think you would potentially see actually quite a shift of the programme. And indeed, the King's Speech announced only yesterday, quite a lot of that might be ripped up and started again. I think the second thing that would happen, though, is that we would not see an end to the psychodrama, because there are a lot of MPs, a lot of Labour members, a lot of Labour voters who don't particularly like Wes Streeting. And I think if he were to win, he would still not have the support of all of his party.
And again, a lot of this might be old news by the time we get there, Jonathan. But where's the assumptions around who the opposition would be? Because Angela Rayner's been cleared this morning, but hasn't she also said over the weekend, it should be Burnham? And he's not an MP, and Ed Miliband's floating around somehow with a bacon sandwich. What's going on with the opposition?
I mean, it's uncannily convenient timing, isn't it? That Angela Rayner is cleared of her tax affairs at 6 o'clock this morning. I mean, just wonderfully fortuitous timing. Clearly, the HMRC were working on overtime when they decided at 6 o'clock this morning that it was all fine. Yeah, as you say, look, she's been making some moves this morning, having previously said maybe she will stand, maybe she won't stand. Andy Burnham is very, very clear that he would like to stand, despite the fact that he's not an MP. He came down to London the other day. He's gone back up to Manchester. It's not clear what he's going to do. Ed Miliband, friends of Ed Miliband have let it be known that he might want to run. Of course, he has a long history in higher education policy as well. It is Miliband of the £6,000 tuition fees, as basically nobody but us calls him. So there's a lot of potential things running around. I suspect what's going to happen is at least two of those people are going to have to buddy up together in a team, because it is not plausible for there to be 3 or 4 or 5 contenders running. So I suspect if and when something does happen this morning, at least one sort of alliance will be formed.
Brooke, we clearly were expecting a skills bill, and it looks like DfE have not won the argument. So, no vehicle for multi-year fee rises, no regulatory reform, no repeal of all those bits of the free speech bill. What does that mean?
That we're working exceptionally hard in this moment to continue to believe that this government has the will to make changes for the benefit of, not just the sector, but really for the whole of British society. I have not hidden my growing cynicism as a born optimist. This sits quite uncomfortably with me, but I think what a Labour MP was anonymously on record this morning saying that the King's Speech was presenting the kind of grand narrative that has come to shape the Labour government over the last 2 years, and it's largely described as as tinkering, really. And I describe what I see from DfE in the same way. I think there's a sad lack of ambition, a sad lack of appetite to make real change, a real political naivete that somehow tinkering around send education is going to be the gift that keeps on giving to the electorate to make change and make impact. Yeah, I find it's woefully lacking, in particular where higher education institutions are concerned, of course. But the argument we've been making at GuildHE lately is that, we're not out here advocating for higher education institutions for their own sake. It's really about, the important roles they play in their own economies, in their localities, and in the broader democratic project, which itself is woefully suffering.
DK, I guess, one of the things that I found interesting about the Welsh election is, Plaid very much had a pitch for change. Now, to be fair, given how long Labour had been in power in Wales, it wasn't hard to make a pitch for change, right? But obviously, Starmer made a pitch for change at the last election. And, rhetorically, that made sense, given the Tories had been in power for a long time. But it just doesn't feel like, despite all the legislation that is bad, it doesn't feel like a lot has changed in the fundamentals, does it?
It does not. I mean, to be fair, the ship of state turns exceedingly slowly. There are changes being made, but they're not the kind of tangible changes in the argot of the political journalists that people can sense in the high streets. The question of, whether or not change is an attractive offer to an electorate who clearly are unhappy with the way things currently are, it's a bit of a no-brainer, isn't it? Of course, everybody's going to run, yes, we're the party of change, we're the party, we're going to fix all these problems. Actually fixing these problems is another matter entirely, which is where people around Wonkhe, I guess, we're interested in implementation. We're not as interested in the idea of the grand narrative, the compelling story that you see in the coverage of exactly why Keir Starmer is a terrible prime minister, largely written by the same people who 2 years ago said this is why Keir Starmer is a fantastic prime minister. He doesn't do stories. He doesn't do narrative. He does actually fixing stuff. And the problem with that is he's either not fixed up or not being good enough about talking about the fact that he has fixed stuff. To translate that to a higher education perspective, there are a lot of things in the higher education world that urgently need to be fixed. Some of these things are tinkering, that we might call it. We probably need to do something about the regulation of freedom of speech in the wake of the Sussex decision. We need to do some stuff to operationalize decisions that are already made. That's stuff that needed to be done. But then beyond that, we have, I guess, what you'd call the narrative questions of, what does the government think higher education is for? What does the government think higher education actually does in the country? And how can it reform it to make sure it can do more of that and less of the things that it doesn't like? But again, that comes down to implementation. We can all sit here and say, I think we all would sit here and say that we need some urgent rethinking of the way higher education is funded. It's clearly not working. The idea that we have a perfectly functioning market system that efficiently allocates resources where they're actually needed is clearly not something that's actually happening. But in terms of, what should replace it? What is the fix here? That is a hard question to answer. And I'm seeing at the moment a lot of people are saying, this is no good. We need change. We need radical change. But if you ask them, what kind of radical change would you actually like to have here? What precisely would you like to do? You don't really get a lot of answers. There's not a lot of policy options out there on the table.
It's really interesting, this, to me, Jonathan. And, I am of course going to bring everything back to Eurovision this week, right? Because that's just where my brain is at. But throughout the week, I've been looking at, European countries. And this morning, I've written about Moldova. And the president in Moldova, who's actually a former HE minister, has done several speeches talking really vividly about the role of higher education in the future of the country. Part of that is about, democratic values and so on and so on. There's a real, it's not just about management and technocracy. In that country, higher education plays this really important role in the narrative of the country. We're just nowhere near that, are we, in the UK?
You're completely right. You're completely right. And it has long frustrated me that actually, if one goes to all the effort of stitching together what the industrial strategy says, what the various kind of plans that spin out of that say, what the government's vision for sort of sovereign AI capability says, what all the work in the creative industries looks like, what their sort of view as to how you fix issues in labour supply and, all sorts of industries. You can draw it all back to education, to higher education, and you can count the references, but you shouldn't need to do that. If only there were such a thing as, say, for example, a higher education minister or a science minister, or even, dare I say it, a prime minister who wanted to give a vision about the future of the country and a future of the labour market and a recognition that the UK is going to continue to need a vast amount of highly skilled people and research-informed industry and the areas in which we think the future of the country will grow. If only somebody could make the case that requires a combination of graduate skilled labour as well as a growing of sort of people at lower levels of qualification. If only such a thing were possible to do. And I do think that speaks to, that is not why Starmer is unpopular, but that there is something about the sort of lack of vision, as was just being talked about a second ago. Like, what is it that people actually want the future of the country to talk about? We know there are challenges. Everyone is incredibly familiar with the economic situation, the global geopolitical situation. We can all sort of commentate on the problems very, very very easily. But actually, I think what the country really wants is someone to say, and here's what I do about it. And both Zach Polanski and the Greens and Nigel Farage and Reform, to their credit, do that. And you might agree with it, you might disagree with it. But actually, I think it's reasonably clear what the Green Party would do, what Reform would do. And that is at least some of the reason why they are picking up votes.
DK, separately, you've written about whether Reform could, obviously Reform did, were the big winners really in last week's set of elections. You've written about whether Reform could actually deliver on the HE rhetoric it has. What have you said?
Yeah, so I feel like this is almost an extension of my previous point. It's absolutely fine to tell people stories and visions of the future. Ideally, they would be hopeful and expansive ones as opposed to negative and fearful ones, but that's maybe a comment for another day. But it all does come down to delivery. So, what I've done on the site is I worked through the main promises that Reform have been making and saying, okay, let's imagine that you wanted to do that. How actually would you do it? I got the inspiration from a book I was reading a couple of weekends ago by a Times journalist called Peter Chappell. The book's called What Happens If Reform Wins, and he calls it like a non-fiction thriller. It's a bit like one of those articles that the Daily Mail does every 6 weeks. It's like, this is what it's like in Zach Polanski's Britain or something like that, but actually rather better done. So in terms of the article that I put together, I've taken each of the Reform proposals and I have just worked them through. Okay, how do you do this in terms of legislation? How do you do this in terms of statutory instruments? How do you do this in terms of actually bringing the country along with you rather than having everybody screaming at you the whole time, which seems to be the main function of government at the moment. So I looked at, say, the proposal around access to fee loans, which is they wanted to remove student loan eligibility from students making applications that did not have a British citizenship, which if you go through to kind of implementing that is mad. Completely insane in that to start off, it's not a DfE problem, it is a Home Office problem. You need to basically reprofile a bunch of people who have kind of passed all the tests and have paid all the fees that they want to be British citizens, and say, well, actually, no, you're not quite there yet. So therefore you lose, you get nothing. And you would need to amend kind of various regulations and kind of various acts. You need to prepare for the ideal of a judicial review that somebody's going to bring. It becomes quite complicated quite quickly, as it is doing anything in government. The pushback I've been getting on this is that, yeah, but that's just assuming that Reform want to play by the rules. I mean, they are basically the bad boys of Brexit. They're just going to breach constitutional norms like Trump has been doing in the US. And my response to that is, okay, in what planet are Reform actually going to get a majority? And if they're not going to get a majority, who's going to be their coalition partner? Who's going to back them up and actually vote for this stuff? And if it's the Conservatives, are they really going to do that, given that they've just had their backsides handed to them by the electorate for mucking about with constitutional norms and just doing things incorrectly? So that was a little bit of a rant in response to your question, but apologies for that.
Brooke, one of the things that really strikes me about all of this is that when I'm sort of floating around, I hear kind of two views really on the prospect of a Reform government. One is, well, if the people of the UK or, electing a Reform government, and, one of the things that the sector has to do is constructively engage with the people who might end up, running the country. There's then another set of people that would say, well, no, hold on. There's no sugarcoating this. The values of higher education do not match the values of this party and populist parties in general. Now, how do you find a way through that?
Well, in fact, Jim, I think you've very well captured, the kind of ongoing challenge of what I referred to previously as the democratic project. You'll forgive me for making it seem quite high and lofty, but actually what you said about the way the Moldovan minister is capturing the importance of higher education in this country is something that, I guess from your own perspective, we just don't get right here in the UK. I don't know if you ever have. We have gotten that right in the US. We have seen, I grew up in a culture where education was absolutely the route to opportunity. It's exactly the draw for so many immigrants from around the world. And we'll just park that there for now. I'm a huge proponent of engaging. You must engage with those with whom you disagree. You must practice the ability to, critically analyze and park your emotional reactivity. Some of what, and people have heard me say this publicly related to this, some of what I feel we're confronting with this push and pull around free speech at the moment is the slippery slope some of us have fallen down in trying to cater to, monitoring or managing all speech that might offend or might upset others, when actually what we want to be doing with most of our young people is building up their resilience and their capability to address and to confront and to challenge those very ideas. And that's a lot of what I would say needs to be done with reform. That's why we sent one of our own policy managers to the conference last year, though many in the sector said, "Why are you doing that? Why would you engage with that?" And I said, "Well, better the devil you know." I mean, I still bristle a bit when I hear, my friend DK on the podcast saying, "Oh, in what planet would reform get a majority?" Well, that's exactly what hundreds of millions of Americans said about the Trump administration in 2016. And so I think it's a reality. Whether or not it's likely is unknown. I don't have a crystal ball, but it is a possibility. And some of what they're proposing around higher education is obviously a reduction in terms of the system, the offering, the access we offer now. Some of it, one of it, they're the only party that I've seen so far, along with possibly the Greens, although I haven't identified that yet, who propose to do things like writing off tuition fee debt for those in our public sector, for those in the NHS. And I think that's exactly some of the creative thinking that our current government and the former government before it have failed to address. And so there is, there's some push and pull. Obviously, there's a lot more that I find challenging. So please don't mistake me as promoting them. But I think there's something to be learned by engaging, and I'm a proponent of that.
Jonathan, one of the things that obviously lots of people say is Starmer's government effectively came into office without having done any real thinking. The kind of baseline arrogant assumption was that as long as some grown-ups were in the room, everything would run better and everyone would be happier. But it strikes me that, the kind of centre-left parties right across the continent are also having this problem, which is there are grand ideas on the extremes of politics, but no real grand idea roughly round the centre.
Exactly so. And I think everything that just Brooke just said, I completely agree with. I think universities do have to engage with reform. I think there is no choice but to do so. Number one, because at the moment in the polls, they're favourites to, if not get a majority, then form the next administration. Secondly, because they already run a bunch of councils in places where universities are, and they have at least some responsibility over higher education, and they need to be formal partners on, research bids, for example. And thirdly, because some students, some members of staff, some local community will vote for them. And so within a university campus at the moment, there will be reform supporters. And, I don't think it is for universities as, at least semi-publicly funded bodies. It's not for universities, I don't think, to make value judgments as to different democratic parties. Vice chancellors, members of staff, students, student unions can absolutely have views, but corporately, institutionally, I think every university is beholden to engage with, Reform, Green, Labour, Liberal Dem, Conservative, Scott Nat, Plaid Cymru, anyone who stands for elected office and wins. On your broader point, Jim, yes, I mean, this is one of the great tragedies of Starmerism, is that it was obvious since Liz Truss's, failed budget and the bond market's going crazy, it was obvious that Labour were going to win. The only question was whether they won with a staggering majority or just quite a big majority. And it is a horrendous abdication of duty that they wasted essentially 2 years not coming up with a plan. And they now find themselves, short of ideas. And again, reform Reform have ideas around higher education. The Conservatives have some ideas actually around higher education. It's one of the areas in which they've made some commitments. The government has a post-16 white paper, which, says a lot of things rhetorically, but actually makes pretty little effort to talk about how any of those things will happen. And as we've just talked about, doesn't have a bill to implement them. So it is a weakness of, let's just call it the political centre for shorthand, that it is abdicating the territory for ideas. And, I've written about this on the site in the past. I think it's likely that the next leader, whoever he or she is, takes the party slightly to the left for shorthand. It's likely, very likely, that they're going to have to spend a lot more time thinking about graduates, thinking about current students, recognizing that actually their base is very highly educated and often graduates. And so they are perhaps going to tilt a little bit more towards thinking about these sorts of ideas and less time thinking about Labour to Reform switchers who tend to be older, tend to be non-graduates. But it's taken them 2 years to realise who their electoral base is and to think about things they need to do.
And Jonathan, the other thing that strikes me is, food price inflation is going to get to 10% in December. Energy bills are going to go through the roof in the September price cap. What we know from the 2022 inflation crisis is no government survives that, does it?
That was one of the reasons that Biden got into so much trouble as well, right? Inflation is a very, very sticky, visible indicator. And I think, almost every government around the world in 2024, not just the Conservative government here in the UK, lost, at least in part because of inflation and price rises. So yeah, absolutely. Again, one of the things which you imagine must drive Rachel Reeves mad. The GDP figures came out this morning. They're actually pretty good. And it just must absolutely be driving her mad, sitting in the Treasury, that every time you sort of think you've got at least semi-control over the economy, something mad happens out of Trump. And the world falls apart, right? And you just think, for the love of God, could you just not...
She opens Truth Social.
Can you not, for heaven's sake, just let me get on with stuff, right? I've just managed to try and tackle inflation. I've just managed to put through public pay rises. I've just managed to deliver a budget. I've just managed to create some more headroom. Are you kidding me? Are you actually kidding me that I've now got to deal once again with rampaging inflation and a price cap in energy? So I have huge, huge sympathy. And I would love to have been on the fly on the wall sometimes where you just think cabinet ministers must just be, cursing and swearing and throwing things. But it's immensely frustrating.
Right, great stuff. Let's see who's been blogging for us this week.
Hi, I'm Rory Cullen from the British Academy, and this week on Wonkhe, I've been blogging about the growing problem of subject cold spots in UK higher education. Our latest data shows that more areas are losing access to key subjects. While overall enrolments can seem stable, the reality is uneven. Provision is shrinking in many regions, and some subjects like modern foreign languages are disappearing from entire parts of the country. We're also seeing a widening divide between institutions. Student numbers are holding up or even growing in some of the research intensives and Russell Group, but declining sharply elsewhere, which is accelerating regional gaps in access. The key point is that this isn't just about individual course closures, it's a system-level issue. Left to market forces and demand alone, some regions risk losing entire subject areas, with consequences for skills, culture, and local opportunity. Without more active stewardship and monitoring from regulators, these cold spots are likely to keep growing and become a permanent feature of the sector.
Now, next up, House of Commons Education Committee has said what many in the sector have been saying for months. There's no clear plan, there's a theme here, for what happens if a large English provider goes under. Jonathan, what did the committee have to say?
Yeah, absolutely. They said this is a very serious issue. And indeed, it is a serious issue. And they said it's been a serious issue for a while. And again, they're absolutely right. It has been a serious issue for a while. One of the things that did surprise me is when a few months ago, the OFS just sort of casually said, oh yeah, it is possible that 24 universities might go bust within the next 12 months, including 7, reasonably big ones, 3,000 students or more. And everyone went, oh, okay, yeah, right, fine. It's that seems to me like quite a big deal. There are a lot of people, there are a lot of jobs, there are a lot of students, there's a lot of tuition free money all wrapped up in that. And everyone's just like, oh yeah, okay, well, we should maybe have a plan about that. And the Education Committee, I think, has put out a good report, essentially saying, as you said, Jim, what others, including, myself and my colleague Jess at Public First have written about is there is no plan. And actually, I think that the key thing was a testimony from Mills Reeve, who said it is not legally clear what happens if a university becomes insolvent. And Jackie Smith said very confidently to the committee, no, it can carry on going. And an actual lawyer said very confidently to the committee, I don't think that's true, or at least we don't know if it's true. And just imagine a scenario, and of course we hope this doesn't happen, but imagine a scenario in which you do have a disorderly exit. And the first thing that is happening is there's an argument between the university, the bank or the banks, DfE, OFS, not as to what happens, but whether or not the legal status is clear as to what can happen. I mean, that again would be a horrendous abdication of duty and responsibility. So the committee talks about all the things that need to happen. There's a series of very sensible recommendations around an early warning system, around a greater system of administration, around greater support for students via strengthened student protection plans. These are all very, very sensible. I look forward to, in the next hour or two, the new administration immediately taking action to deal with it. I'm confident that this will be sorted by the end of the week, and so we don't have to worry about it. But if hypothetically such a thing didn't happen, I think it is yet another example of the government leaving really, really important issues on the table.
Yes. Oh, this is bleak. I mean, Brooke, in a way, the asks here are familiar, aren't they? So, a bespoke insolvency regime, prioritise student protection and teach out, protect strategically critical courses, avoid cold spots. I mean, that actually does sound like it would cover quite a lot of your membership.
Yeah, indeed, it would cover quite a lot of the sector. We certainly welcome committee scrutiny of this issue, and I'll say that as my positive reflection. We certainly welcome the committee's position on the back of that report that providers are these essential civic and economic anchors, recognizing that the cumulative cost of regulation needs to be addressed, that there needs to be greater coordination. I mean, all of that reflects arguments that certainly GuildHE has been making. Vivian has been making them as well on behalf of UK. Again, this is a little bit more of that kind of, we're tinkering a little bit. We've got a little policy over here about insolvency, which, while a major confronting issue for the sector, doesn't equate to whole systems leadership in terms of, offering a positive vision of what we really want the sector. And I agree with some previously vocalized commentary about the kind of white paper being kind of a rhetorical study of what might be, but without real strategic vision or levers. And I think we're still in that place, although with the committee coming around now and taking a look at where we are in terms of the insolvency piece, it's quite helpful. I mean, again, from somebody who, at the point I was working at OFS, I was instrumental in handling a key market exit case. It was shocking that more learning hadn't been taken on board from previous insolvencies that were not too far in the past, and I don't see a strong evidence that there's been much learning on the back of that market exit. So again, committee attention can be helpful in pushing that forward, but I think, again, this is another one of these issues that DfE just hopes sorts itself out.
DK, you've written about this conflicting evidence on the legal position. Could you just unpack this? What's going on there?
Yeah, so, I mean, basically, as Jonathan puts it, there are a number of very serious lawyers who say there is not a legal position in which a provider that becomes insolvent can keep trading. Now, we need to unpack a little bit the definitions of those words. So insolvency would mean a provider was no longer able to meet its ongoing obligations in terms of finance, in terms of payroll, in terms of stuff like that. And the ability to keep trading. In general, a company that is insolvent is only allowed to continue trading under special circumstances, usually in the grasp of an appointed administrator as opposed to the current administrator. But in order to get out of that particular hole, it needs to keep trading. It's quite difficult for a company just to stop entirely and then recover and do a new thing, even if somebody else takes it over, especially if you're thinking about something like higher education, where you've got to keep paying academics, you've got to keep the lights on, you've got to keep teaching students, or you've not really got a business model, to be quite frank. So the legal opinion is that the weird ways in which certain universities are set up, particularly in terms of those that are set up by a royal charter, I believe it is, it's not clear which set of rules apply, if they can keep trading, if they cannot keep trading, if they get into trouble. Now, we've just literally, as we're recording, we've had the OFS's readout on the financial state of the sector. But there'll be stuff on the site about this later today. I've only just skimmed it. I don't want to do too much. But there are a number number of providers who have got a very low number of net days of liquidity. Now, net days of liquidity basically means the number of days you could keep trading for if you didn't get any more income. It's not like something that will definitely happen, but it's it's a kind of a stress test. There are a load of providers, including some quite big ones, who have got less than 30 days of net liquidity. Now, back in the days of COVID, that was the cutoff point. If you got below that, you had to ring up the regulator and say, "I'm terribly sorry, sir, but we're useless at finance and we're going to close. Can you help us?" And then they step in and sort it out. But if you're under 30 days of net liquidity, if you could run for less than a month without any income, and there are some big names here. I'm just looking at this list and I'm like, oh my word, this is in the HESA data if anyone's playing along at home. This is a clear and present danger of somebody somewhere going into some kind of insolvency. Now, there needs to be a watertight plan of what you are going to do if this insolvency happens, purely and simply from this perspective of protecting the students and protecting the public investment that goes along with them. It gets expensive quite quickly if you muck that up. So you need to have a watertight plan for what you do immediately. Now, after that, you need to think about the long-term sustainability of higher education in that place, in that region. There's some places here that are doing a particular thing or are in a particular place. There's not an easy duplicate to what they do. And you would need to think strategically about, okay, yes, we probably do need a large general university or that kind of an offer in this place to make that place work. And then this goes beyond the niceties of accounting into an active government decision to say, okay, we need to get behind higher education in this city, in this town. And how do we do that? And again, there needs to be a plan for how that will work. And as far as we know, there's not one.
Jonathan, help me out here, right? So, and I know we've had this conversation before in the context of franchising, but there's clearly a chunk of the people who work in sanctuary buildings on Great Smith Street who, have a set of quite sophisticated controls around franchising in FE, ran a set of area reviews to try and sort out the kind of size and shape of the FE sector, about a decade ago. And in FE, there is a bespoke insolvency regime. How is it that none of this is possible, at the policy level, to transfer the thinking from one floor to another?
So I think there are some quite important legal differences when it comes to things like insolvency between FE and HE. They do have slightly different legal statuses, and certainly given FE is much more under government control, it is slightly more straightforward to give a partial defence to my DfE colleagues. But nonetheless, the broad thrust of your question is exactly right. Is it possible to design a policy architecture that allows for a special administration regime, that designs a greater student protection regime, that allows for sort of greater monitoring of finances? Of course it is. Fundamentally, these are not wholly dissimilar institutions, and they sit next to each other on the same floor, as DK has just pointed out. So it's not like they don't even know who they should go and talk to about it. I think there are two things that really make this happen. One is that, well, actually three things. There are three things that make this happen. One is that DfE remain nervous about this sort of mythical ONS review that might put universities back onto the public sector balance sheet, and this review that's been sort of carrying on for a decade or so, but nonetheless hangs like a sword of Damocles. And I've had senior DfE people say to me very explicitly, we are worried that if we create an architecture which is really very, very all-encompassing, that would give greater grounds for the universities to go back onto the public sector balance sheet. The second thing they are worried about is accidentally causing more difficulty to the sector. This is certainly true in the case of franchising. I know absolutely that there are vice chancellors talking to the department saying, look, if you make a move on franchising that closes aspects of that too quickly, you will actually precipitate real financial difficulty amongst at least some of the institutions you're simultaneously trying to save here. And the third thing that they think about quite a lot is university autonomy. And again, for better or worse, they have always seen FE colleges as a full-on extension of government, whether they were formerly in the public sector or not. There are a lot of people in the university sector and a lot of people in the House of Lords who are very, very keen on the issue of university autonomy. And again, there's at least some parts of politicians that think, well, okay, this is sort of for these guys to sort out because they are more autonomous.
Brooke, just from a student perspective for a second, right? When the Higher Education and Research Act was out and the stuff around student protection came out, I broadly read that as, look, we might not tell you if your provider is going to go bust, because that would, or close to going bust, because that might precipitate it going bust. But the deal is, although we won't tell you, we'll properly protect you through, proper student protection arrangements. Now, if those student protection arrangements aren't working, and Reddit is full of, and it is as of today, Reddit is full of students, applicants speculating about whether their institution might be close to the brink, don't we have to tell them?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's no easy answer to this, to be honest. Would I want my child applying to a university that is, on the brink of closure? Of course not. I suppose the issue for me comes back to just, again, the kind of conditions that we're establishing for universities, and we are establishing them by continuing to not make decisions at government level because of all of the, well-founded fears that Jonathan just articulated amongst our civil service colleagues. And I too recognize that they just work tirelessly to try to avoid the worst possible eventualities. But in some ways, that also paralyzes us from taking decisions that are difficult. The student protection plans have always been flawed. Having seen them myself, I wasn't working closely with them, but again, in overseeing the Alra market exit case, it was clear that by the time the OFS was aware that this provider was indeed closing, they were closing within a matter of a week and a half. That's how dire the situation was. And it was all from relatively kind of unbelievable and yet sort of understandable conditions. A senior team had all kind of fled the building, and the board had moved very quickly to move in interims over the course of several months. And the interns got in and saw exactly why that team had kind of fled the building over the period of 6 months, and the conditions were terrible. And then the administrators came in and they started to talk much to what DK was saying. Actually, they're saying, well, your students, nobody cares about your students in this particular legal form. They are not creditors. They are not any sort of vested stakeholder that needs to be acknowledged. And I personally, as well as others around the table, found that issue shocking. So that was clear. There's a kind of legal form implications to where and how students would even be considered in terms of a provider closure. And then having a plan on paper that says, if we close down, we'll do X, Y, or Z, it clearly was ridiculous. And you do get then a bunch of people scrambling behind the scenes over weekends trying to negotiate options for students with no time to go to the students and say, do you like that option? Would you prefer that option? Your options basically are this: if you want to continue your studies, here's where you're going to transfer to. And if you don't want to continue your studies under these conditions, which we could totally understand, you don't have to do that. It's a pretty poor set of options you have there. I don't have a better option at the moment for how to treat that. And I am sensitive to the kind of making public more of the financial situation of the institutions for the reasons we talked about precipitating their decline. I would like to see a much stronger plan from government around which institutions, which areas, which provisions absolutely need to be maintained regardless, to give at least some semblance of certainty that we could start to build upon.
And then Jonathan, one other thing on this, which is, kind of predictably, what the report does is focus on institutional collapse. And, that's what journalists do and so on. But, if I think about the two big pieces of research output that OFS has put out over the past year, one of which probably, you were involved in, they tell this story of not explosion where a provider collapses, but implosion where lots and lots of changes are made to courses and faculties and services and so on. And students say, well, this is not what I signed up for. This is not what I expected. Is this problem, we think it might happen. Isn't this problem from a student perspective already there?
Yes, in many ways, absolutely. And indeed, only this week, the British Academy did an update of their cold spots. And, you can already see chunks of the country where, certain courses aren't available across the whole region. And that is increasingly a problem given rising number of commuter students, rising number of students essentially working full time. The sort of model that says, well, it doesn't matter that there's no, philosophy on the South Coast, because if you want to study philosophy, you just move to a university that offers it. It is not necessarily a practical solution. So you're absolutely right. The danger of saying like, well, if you can't do a massive, great big thing and you can't have a skills bill and you can't introduce a new special administration regime, well, let's just sort of leave it, is that you do miss out exactly that, the sort of small creeping changes which are happening now, and a whole series of individual decisions being made by individual vice chancellors chancellors summing to something which is suboptimal. I mean, that was my argument and remains my argument as to why actually government does need to do something, because you essentially have a tragedy of the commons going on here, that everybody decides that they don't want chemistry anymore, so they close their own chemistry faculty, and then you sort of look around and it turns out it's like, oh, there's no chemistry within. You're absolutely right. The basic premise is that what is happening beneath the surface is that students are getting an increasingly raw deal, module choices are being restricted, the physical estate is sort of growing in wear and tear, and this is, it's not as visible as a big bang failure, but it is nonetheless really, really affecting day-to-day student experiences.
Now, James Coe's here with news of a merger.
Hot on the heels of City St George's, Kent and Greenwich, the latest in our trifecta of mergers, King's College London and Cranfield University are proposing a merger to, in their words, support the UK's national capability and resilience. The two universities have now signed an agreement with the aim of bringing them together by August 2027, with the aim to create a university especially equipped for the changing world, to enhance opportunities and resources of students, and to bring a distinctive offer for the UK's future. This will have a footprint that spans London and the Oxford-Cambridge Growth Corridor, and in the words and support of Lord Patrick Vallance, will be a driver of innovation and growth and capitalise on the complementary strengths and specialisms of both institutions. Readers, listeners to Wonkhe may have seen that I've been sceptical that any more mergers would happen because I thought they were too complex, too costly, too time-consuming. Egg on my face, as one has now been announced. There may be more to come, this could be it, but nonetheless, a very, very interesting day in the world of higher education. More to come over at Wonkhe.
Every one of us who works in higher education knows our own patch pretty well. Far few of us can hold the whole picture: funding, teaching, research, students, data, governance, people strategy, all of it at once. That's the gap that Making Sense of Higher Education is built to close. It's a new programme from Wonkhe. 10 live online modules, 1 hour each, running from October to April, delivered by the team you already listened to on this podcast, plus special guests across the series. It's built for people new to the sector, for governors, for mid-career professionals, and for academic leaders who want something different. Early bird tickets are open now. There's 10% off until the 31st of July. Further discounts are available for Wonkhe subscriber organisations and large groups. You can find the full programme and book your place at wonkhe.com/events.
Now, over the course of the next year, here at Wonkhe, we want to help you make sense of HE. Now, finally this week, it's Eurovision Week, and the King's Policy Institute has marked the occasion, sort of, with a comparative report on European higher education, Brooke.
Indeed, yes. This is the culmination of a workshop held last summer with academic experts from across the UK and the EU coming together to talk about current trends and challenges in England, France, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Switzerland. So it proposes to give a bit of a kind of oversight of those trends. Headlines from the report are really looking at kind of what's happened with higher education in the post-World War II, what they call Golden Age, where access to higher education has progressively expanded, where you've seen universities changing from those historically tied to the church, small and catering to a kind of elite group of people, towards the massified offer that we would recognize today, with much stronger links also to economic growth. And of course, we've just been talking a bit about that. Across Europe and the OECD nations as well, we see about 50% of young people are now qualified to degree level, which is a significant growth over the past 30 years. But there is currently a similar picture in a lot of places. So you see per student funding falling, class sizes rising, academic careers less stable, issues related to academic freedom and free speech, a war against wokeism, and a kind of challenging of a historical stratification, or rather a stratification that might come from those historical foundings of the universities I've mentioned. So you've got kind of older elite institutions versus newer institutions, and that's quite common across the European piece. Certainly with populism rising and rising or established as a significant minority political presence in many European countries, there have been questions about shifting public attitudes towards higher education, and in many cases kind of growing skepticism or at least weakening of support, and really how that informs interactions between universities and far-right governments is an ongoing discussion. These questions certainly include ones about affordability of higher education, both for those students who might want to study there and also for government public investment. So that's kind of the whole. It's interesting. You can dive in deep a bit if you want to a couple of the contexts, but that's kind of the main takeaways.
Jonathan, I wrote about this on Monday, it does feel curiously sort of Western Europe.
Yes, you're right. It does. And actually, one of the interesting things about some of the sort of post-Soviet Eastern European states is actually they do sort of tend to privilege education and do have a sort of great attachment to that and do see it as a route through to economic growth. One of the things that I find fascinating about a lot of this cross-country work is in some senses a complacency born of longevity. So one of the most bleak polling results that you can look at is when you ask young people in a whole range of very, very democratic nations the extent to which they actually really care about democracy versus just want a strong leader. And you can see an incredible age split, which is basically how quickly people can remember conflict. So the older you are, the more likely you are to privilege democracy and all the things that come with it and the ways in which the citizenry can protect themselves, including through education. And the younger you are, and the more that you think like, oh, this is just a topic for the history books, the less likely you are to actually value some of this stuff. And I do think there is something across Western Europe, which is a sense of, well, okay, this is all fine, but actually, we do then therefore worry about it. We do worry about, graduate elitism. We do think that they don't stand up for normal people. All the discourse that we're very familiar with in the UK, we do see happening across bits of Western Europe as well. Interestingly, of course, it does show that for the accusations that actually the UK disenchantment is driven by fees is probably not true, because as a report points out, we're something of an outlier in the way in which we fund our tertiary education system, and yet this sort of similar disillusionment across Western Europe, including in much more state-funded systems.
DK, one particular thing that strikes me is that in a lot of other countries, the debate about whether there are too many people at university is just more sophisticated. In other words, it's not really how many graduates do we need, it's how many do we need, in which subjects, in which parts of the country, and how do we get them to stay in that part of the country, particularly given freedom of movement. Now, my sense is that the more of the overall cost of HE that you put in from the public purse, the easier it is to boss around where HE should happen and what students should study. And so we're sort of trapped, aren't we, in the UK, by having this very high fees, very high graduate contribution, but yet we also have this labour market mismatch problem that everyone else seems to be having.
Yeah, I mean, there is an overall issue with this report, which, although it's spectacularly well done in many ways, it does tend to want to set European higher education in opposition to the system in the US. And that's kind of like the country that dare not speak its name all the way through the report, that we're comparing, we're saying we're not as high in the league tables as the US, we're not attracting the globally significant researchers as the US are doing. So therefore, there is a deficit in higher education in Europe, and we need maybe to think about that. That's broadly the thesis, as I read it, of the thing, which is a very Alison Wolfe take, I have to say. But I mean, obviously, she's largely involved in it, so that would be why. In terms of the idea of designing a system as opposed to letting the market establish a system, in Europe, we've been, I think, a lot more interested in the idea of high quality higher education provision for all. If you look at the US and to a lesser extent other parts of North America, there is some very high quality provision, but there's also some quite awful provision that in any European country just would not be allowed to exist. We're much better, although this has changed a little in recent years, we're much better at gatekeeping the sector and saying, okay, this kind of thing is higher education, this kind of thing is not higher education, and we're not really concerned about it. And if you want to give somebody a pile of money to learn that, then please go ahead, but we're having no part in it. In terms of choosing the size and shape of our sector, this is a tool set that we have in Europe that we don't have in the US, that we don't really use in the UK. It's, as the report sets out, it's much stronger in countries like France or in Germany, where we decide, okay, we need a lot of this kind of institution. We need an elite institution that train the next generation of leaders. We also need institutions specialized at training the next generation of engineers or the next generation of social workers or such like. In the UK, we tend to assume in a classic kind of UK way that we can all just muddle through and the market will largely provide what we need. And if there's a few problems around the edges, we can do a little bit of an intervention here and there. The choice has been, overwhelmingly in England at least, not to do that. outside of medicine and healthcare. And we're starting to see the weakness of that we're not making the choices that we need to make. Quite how we get out of this particular trap, other than, as seems to be the theme of this podcast, the government stepping in and making actual decisions. I think the advent of kind of devolution to local and regional authorities is going to help that a little bit, as long as these local and regional authorities are realistic about what they need and what they need to do. Yes, we probably need in the Northeast a lot more provision in logistics, in engineering, in social work. We're probably not going to re-establish the West End of London in the Northeast. It is good that we have arts and creative subjects up there. It's good that we have a creative scene in the Northeast, but that's never going to be the economic powerhouse of the Northeast. So we probably at some point we need to come out and actively say that, or things like that.
We don't take the, grab this challenge by the shoulders and say, let's stand up for the system we know we need in this system. I want us to get away from this, as you described it, muddling by. We don't do what European countries do, apparently, in terms of really shaping. We do leave it up to a bit of the market that's much more American, that's really under this kind of free enterprise capitalism where your human capital is all we need for economic growth, and it will get graduates higher salaries, and then they'll fuel the economy that way, and they'll just get more effort from them, and that's the whole productivity mirage that we've been sold. And I think Alison, to her credit, does problematize that a bit by getting into the graduate premium problem, and in a massified system you will see that premium drop. But the report doesn't it doesn't grip the nettle of the fact that the current political and financial reality we are facing, certainly here in the UK, is related to income inequality, experienced most acutely here, definitely in the US. It's linked, and as we need to move away from seeing higher education as a job training facility and get back to the fact that yes, it will give the high professional skills we need in a 21st century economy, and it will also give the skills that produce a much happier, more contented and active political citizenry, which is what we need if we call ourselves a democracy.
So that's about it for this week. Remember to go in deep on anything we've discussed today. You'll find links in the show notes on wonkhe.com. Don't forget to subscribe. Just search for The Wonkhe Show wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to get ahead of everything going on in UKHE, just click subscriptions on the site to find out more. So thanks very much to Brooke, Jonathan, David, Michael, Salmon for making it all happen behind the scenes. We'll be back next week. Mark will be here. Until then, stay wonky.